Okay,
Right.
we'll turn it over to you, Paige.
Now.
Yeah, got it.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here. Danielle is the one who put us in touch. I used to work for her. That was at the IOC2 is where I worked for her. She's really great. So I'm so happy that she reached out. I did prepare some slides. Would I be able to share my screen?
Try to do that. I believe we should be able to.
It says that screen sharing is disabled at the moment.
It's disabled? Okay. Okay.
And while we wait, I do want to mention two things. First is that everything that I say is my own opinion and research. I'm not representing my current employer or any previous employers. And then the other thing is I have a cat who really likes to join Zoom videos, so she might make an appearance. Her name is Fiona.
Right. What's her name?
Fiona.
Well, I can't speak for everyone, but I'm an animal lover, so I would not mind a guest appearance from.
Yes, she loves the camera. She's not shy. Okay, I can share my screen now. Actually, let me open up the other one. Can everybody see the slides?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. All right, like I said, thank you for having me. I'm really excited. I was planning on leaving some time at the end for questions, but it is a small group, so I'm okay if you want to jump in and ask questions as we go. That's totally fine. There's a lot of information, so I'll probably move kind of quickly, but I'm happy to go back and discuss anything else that you might have questions about, especially since I'm not entirely sure what everyone's background is or level of familiarity is. So I'm super happy to dive into whatever you guys are interested in today.
Yeah, you know what? I would probably just say to proceed with your presentation, and if it's I don't know, 15, 20 minutes or so, then we'll have plenty of time for questions. And then we'll have and then I'd like to also introduce you to our task force chair for human trafficking. And perhaps she might have some, her name is Renee Soriano. She is one of our members of SPAC, and she may have some questions or remarks that she might want to share.
Absolutely. Sounds great. So this is just kind of roughly what I wanted to cover today. I wanted to start pretty broad and talk about the terms and definitions that we frequently see when we're talking about human trafficking. There's a lot of different types of human trafficking, which helps us understand localities and what kind of challenges that you might face in a volunteer or legislative organization. I'll talk a little bit about some of the recent examples in the news, just because I always find it's really helpful to ground yourself in real events to kind of understand what we're talking about. And then I'll finish up talking about victim-centered responses and then some of the resources that I prefer to go to when I'm doing my research. So to begin, human trafficking, a very widely accepted definition, is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person into commercial sex acts or labor against their will. This is very broad, but there's three components here that are pretty important for defining when human trafficking might be occurring. And I don't think it's as common now, but I think for a long time, a lot of people thought that, I don't see it, so it's not happening. It's not happening around me. This doesn't happen where I live. And when I was at the Department of Justice, there was a prosecutor who liked to say that if you have people and you have the movement of money, then you probably have a human trafficking problem. Because ultimately, the goal of human trafficking is to use other people to make money. And one caveat that I wanted to add in is that if the victim, the person being trafficked, is underage, then the element of force, fraud, or coercion doesn't need to be proven because they're underage and therefore can't consent to whatever it is that they're being forced to do. So keep in mind during this presentation that a lot of what I'm talking about is assuming that the victim is an adult. It gets there's a lot of different things that are different when we're talking about minors versus adult victims. And you could probably do an entirely different presentation on kind of that subtype of minor victims. So to further break down what we're talking about is the Polaris Project is a really great organization. They do a lot of research, and they also run the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So I pulled this model from their website. It's the Action Means Purpose model, and it's just another way of understanding what human trafficking is and what it can look like and how to understand it. So when we're talking about action, means, and purpose, we're talking about the trafficker or the person doing the trafficking takes an action by using the means of force, fraud, or coercion and getting a victim to do something to make money for the trafficker. And that could be sex trafficking, forced labor, other types of trafficking. And when we're talking about the actions here, it could be that the trafficker has recruited the victim, has kind of, talking them into doing something, deceives them into a job, makes these really great offers, takes an action that we can define, and then also uses force, fraud, or coercion. So that would be the element of deception, the part that makes the victim do something without their consent or kind of not without their full consent. And when we're talking about proving that human trafficking is happening, generally we're looking for one of these elements or all of these elements when we think that there might be trafficking happening. And this is a very fun little graphic that I put together just to try to visualize what this actually means. And I like the use of the arrows because I think that it shows that some sort of purpose is being imposed upon the victim. And I think a lot of times in the media, maybe not so much now, once again, but I think very often it is said that there's a lot of victim blaming where, well, they should have known better, they shouldn't have done this or that, they should have asked for help. And there's a lot of forces at play that are pushing victims into these opportunities for being trafficked. And I want to talk a little bit more about the terms that we're using. So far, you've heard me talk about victims and traffickers. But the terms that we use also, once again, depends on the type of trafficking that we're talking about. So for example, with sex trafficking, a lot of times in the US, it also depends on the geography because sex trafficking in the US is usually based on a pimp model where the trafficker is a pimp or a boyfriend or some other kind of boss. The recruiter is a second in command who's often referred to as a madame, and then the buyers are called Johns. That model is very specific to the US, and sex trafficking looks very different based on where you're living, what country you're in, what the social norms are, all of that. And we use all of these terms to talk about the roles that people have. But what you won't see is, like Victoria mentioned, there's no universal profile of who is a typical victim, who is a typical trafficker. It really just depends on opportunities for exploitation. And that could be someone's age. Maybe they're elderly and they're dependent on someone, and that person can take advantage of them. And then that might become, might turn into some sort of financial money mule trafficking situation. Gender dynamics, nationality, legal status, financial burdens, social isolation. There are all of these different parts of someone's identity that a good trafficker will know how to exploit. And so that is why it's so difficult to identify victims, which is why it's really helpful to talk about typologies, which I will get into, I think, in the next couple of slides. So this is something that I have taken from the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and domestic violence and human trafficking are different. I do volunteer for a domestic violence hotline in Northern Virginia. And so this is kind of me kind of merging a couple different parts of my background and experience. I do think that this tool, it's called the Power and Control Wheel, I think it has a lot to offer in terms of understanding the multitude of tools that traffickers have at their disposal to keep a victim within their sphere of influence. So for domestic violence victims, this is often a tool that we refer to when we're thinking about a victim's situation in terms of being under the influence and abuse of somebody else. It's not just, physical violence where you might think of someone is gonna beat you up if you leave, so that's why you stay. It's not necessarily someone chaining you to the wall and making you like physically keeping you imprisoned somewhere. There are a lot of different tools for implementing that force, fraud, or coercion element that we talked about earlier. And you can see here that, it could be financial, it's a lot of psychological games. It could be a lot of traffickers benefiting from social norms like male privilege, whatever the victim has ingrained in them, the trafficker will use that to their advantage. And again, it's not going to look the same for everybody because, for example, you could have a victim who is worried about their legal status in the US. And the trafficker could threaten to take away their documents and report them to ICE. That's not going to work for someone who isn't concerned about their legal status. So it really just absolutely depends on the context and the situation that people are in. One thing I wanted to make sure I talked about a little bit was smuggling versus trafficking. I think there's a lot of confusion. Oftentimes these terms are used interchangeably, and I think it's important to think about why they might be two separate things, even if they are related. So first on the left, I have smuggling. That's generally categorized as a crime against a border. It's moving something from one jurisdiction to another. Usually, if people are being smuggled, they have consented and paid for the service. If they haven't consented and paid for their service, then it would be trafficking. But even when somebody is willing and ready to be smuggled, they're in a situation that has a lot of vulnerability to being trafficked. Trafficking, on the other hand, doesn't require movement across a border. You can be trafficked in the same town that you were born and raised and have lived your entire life, and you can be trafficked without ever leaving that town. Once again, trafficking requires that element of force, fraud, and coercion, so there has to be a reasonable question about the consent of the victim. And then I think another distinction to point out is that the victim is doing the action that is making money for the trafficker. Whereas in smuggling, the trafficker is providing the service. In trafficking, the victim is providing the service. And I have an example at the bottom, and hopefully the color coding makes sense. But I think this example kind of shows how they are separate things, but they can often, smuggling can turn into trafficking. So for example, if someone it wants to pay to be smuggled into the US from whatever country that they're coming from, they can pay for that and they can be smuggled. And at that point, they have moved into the US, and that is an act of smuggling. That's the crime against the border. Once they're in the US, though, the trafficker can then bring them, well, the smuggler could be either a recruiter or a trafficker, but they could be taken to the trafficker. The trafficker could take away their legal documents. They could tell the victim suddenly, oh, well, we agreed on $2,000 and you paid $2,000 to get smuggled here, but actually the costs ended up being more like $50,000 and you need to work for me until you pay that debt off. So that's a type of trafficking that we call debt bondage. And then there's a whole bunch of leverage that the trafficker then has over the victim, including, again, reporting them for their legal status, for they probably have contacts in their home country that can threaten their family. There's a whole bunch of different ways that people who are smuggled can be vulnerable to trafficking, even once they're in the US. They may not speak English, so they are afraid to go to law enforcement or advocacy groups. They may not even know about advocacy groups. So there's a lot of cultural and linguistic barriers on top of all of the legal, psychological barriers that you already face. Yeah, so that's just a quick example of uh, debt bondage, which kind of takes smuggling into trafficking. So now I'll talk a little bit more about other typologies. Polaris Project, which I mentioned earlier, did a study in 2016 that classified trafficking into 25 different sectors across the US. I don't know if this is still current because it was in 2016 and I don't know if they've updated it. So I would imagine that it's potentially changed since 2016. But I really like going back to this report because it reminds me that it's not just popular cases that we see in the media. It's not just sex trafficking, which does get a lot of attention. But there's a lot of variety and it will look different for each locality. So for this slide, I don't want you to focus on the numbers necessarily, but this list on the left is the 25 categories that Polaris categorized trafficking cases into. And as you can see, it's like there's a very wide variety. And we have categories that I think are pretty popular when you think of sex trafficking. I think a lot of people think of escort services, outdoor solicitation, pornography, residential sex trafficking. But I don't necessarily think people always consider the range of industries where forced labor, there's an opportunity for forced labor in the US. So like traveling carnivals, that can include county fairs when you have groups that travel from state fairs and county fairs across the country that, it's not super regulated in a lot of places. People just kind of show up and plant themselves, and that gives them a lot of leeway for hiring people who are vulnerable to trafficking. Hotels and hospitality, health and beauty services, and illicit activities. I had a question once about what that would be, and that means people are trafficked into labor involving illegal activities, such as someone gets trafficked into drug dealing or drug manufacturing, or it doesn't have to be drugs. That's just the examples I have in my brain right now, but it would be someone being trafficked into a life of crime, basically. And I always think peddling and begging is another category that was really shocking to me when I first heard about that. Because a lot of times it's children and people who are experiencing homelessness who are vulnerable to being exploited in this industry. And yeah, it just very shocking to me when I found out that people will force other people to go beg on the street for them. Yeah, it's a fun topic. So just to demonstrate once again that there is no universal victim, Polaris also broke down the victim demographics in 2016 by the type of trafficking. So to start on the left, we see escort services, and I think most people would definitely expect the demographics that we see there. We see 94% female, a little over half were adult, but almost half were minors, and about half were US citizens. If we compare this to the traveling sales crews and the restaurant industry, we see that it's closer to half and half of male and female distribution. Not so much gender minorities, mostly adults, and there's an interesting contrast between traveling sales crews and restaurants in terms of citizenship. And traveling sales crews are about half US citizens, whereas restaurant victims are they're 83% foreign nationals, which is really interesting. And I think that just leads to questions of why, and probably just leads to locality and maybe even questions about restaurant regulations and hiring practices. Yeah, so I thought this was an interesting graphic just to demonstrate the point again that you can't just look at someone and know that they're being trafficked. Now I'll talk about some examples in the news. And with you all being in New Jersey, I figured that you'd be somewhat familiar with the Hindu temple is built in Robbinsville, New Jersey. The building opened in October 2023, and it is really gorgeous. It took 10 years to build, and it cost $96 million to build. And the really interesting part is that it was built by volunteers. They recruited about 12,500 volunteers. And it ended up being that some of them were probably unpaid employees. The federal law enforcement raided the temple in 2021. I believe the investigation is still ongoing. There are allegations of passport confiscation. People were paid or promised wages and then paid below what they were promised. They had to work excessive hours. The living conditions were really poor. Like people were living on top of each other. And so I think that raises a lot of questions about how complex this can quickly get. So the victims in this case would be the exploited workers. And I think there was a lot of opportunities for exploitation in this case. The articles that I read about this cited that the temple recruited people in India who were living in lower income areas associated with the Dalit caste, which is traditionally a very poor caste social stratus in India. So there's that financial exploitation. Incentivizing people to come to the US and getting a visa sponsorship and getting good wages to send back home. And then they show up and they don't get it. Well, there's that element of fraud and deception that kind of makes us probably alerted law enforcement to look closer into what was going on. We'll see that other opportunities would be there was probably a language and cultural barrier once people got here and started working on the building and realized that something was wrong. I don't know how comfortable someone would have been to go and report to law enforcement in another country while they're on a visa to, seek help against potentially making allegations against the people that were either paying you or promising to pay you or help your family out. So this is just an example. It's close to home and it can happen anywhere. And there are always opportunities for exploitation. I had a couple other examples that took place in Alabama and Georgia, and there's actually a lot of, if you do any amount of Googling on either of these cases, because they're kind of connected, you'll see a lot of different reporting. So there's a lot of ongoing intertwining investigations as far as I can tell. I don't know how familiar you all are with this, but the news broke in, I think, 2022 that there was a use of child labor in the Hyundai plants in Alabama. It was actually a school official who first reported this to law enforcement. I wasn't able to find any details on what the school official actually reported, but the case that I was reading about was there was a 14-year-old girl. Her family had come to the US from Guatemala. Her family was really worried about making enough money to be able to stay in their apartment. So the dad and the daughter went to this third-party recruitment staffing agency to see if they could get jobs. The staffing agency placed the dad and the daughter on an assembly line at this factory in Alabama. And I believe that they had obtained a fake ID for the 14-year-old that said that she was 18. And then they commuted. The company provided transportation. I think it was a 90-minute commute both ways. And then they took the cost of transportation out of their wages. So there was the underage labor and then the deception of the wage fraud. And then a few different victims who spoke anonymously with news sources said that they were frequently threatened with deportation by the staffing agencies if they spoke up about the fact that they were working with children in these factories. Similarly, I don't know what's going on with these third-party staffing agencies. There's a couple different class action lawsuits going on related to a visa bait and switch scheme that happened based in Georgia. So I don't know if it was the same staffing agencies, but it was also third-party staffing agencies for Hyundai Kia, who were recruiting college graduates from engineering schools in Mexico, offering them trade NAFTA visas. So that visa type is specifically for skilled labor and people like engineers and technicians. Really great job. The goal is to encourage the flow of skilled labor from Canada and Mexico into the US. And then when the recruits got there, they were placed on the assembly line and then paid below minimum wage, which in Georgia is $7.25. So as you can imagine, that was a huge discrepancy in what they were promised. They were deceived. And then because they were on a visa held by the employer, they were then threatened and in some cases coerced to remain employed in that area. As far as I can tell, I don't know if there are any ongoing law enforcement investigations, but there are some class action lawsuits taking place on that, and I believe those are still developing. So keep an eye on that if you're interested. I had one other example in here just because I'm from Ohio, so I did throw in some Ohio things. Last weekend, this was actually a really big case. There was a man from Columbus who was sentenced to 14 years in prison. And this is a little bit more what you're more likely to see in the news for sex trafficking. He would approach women who are experiencing homelessness and recruit them for prostitution. So he ended up being charged with compelling prostitution. And then part of how he did that was incentivizing or getting women hooked on drugs or giving them drugs in exchange for operating in a prostitution ring. So as you can see, there was a lot of opportunity for exploitation. The man used threats, drugs, and physical violence, and fortunately, they did get him in this case. Yeah, I think it's good to see the successes, but it also just kind of highlights how vulnerable people can be, especially when they are literally living on the street. And that is actually something that Polaris Project has done a few recent studies on, which is the youth, as Victoria mentioned, when runaway youths are at very high risk of being trafficked. And Polaris Project did a research paper on youths who run away from home due to sexual orientation issues. So they're feeling isolated or they get kicked out of the house or they feel like they don't have anywhere to go to be themselves. So it's unfortunately a very high danger for homeless LGBTQ children to fall into this type of scheme. So talking about something a little bit more positive, I'd like to talk about what a victim-centered response means. You might have heard this before. This comes more from the advocacy social services side of the industry. The goal of a victim-centered response is to empower the victim to take charge in their own healing, the decision-making about, what healing means for them and moving forward means, their storytelling, and that includes being able to decide whether they testify or not in court. And essentially, the goal is to minimize the trauma and the re-traumatization of the victim after, once they are removed from that situation. And this sounds really great. It can be extremely difficult to do in practice. And I do have another Ohio example. In Columbus, there's something called Catch Court. And I saw a couple different sources of what this acronym stands for. I've seen changing actions to change habits, and I've also seen creating autonomy through collaborative healing. I liked them both, so I put them both in there. The purpose of Catch Court is it's a specialized municipal court that when victims of trafficking are going through the justice system, they can go through Catch Court instead of the regular normal court. And if they go through Catch Court, this means that there's a 2-year basically rehabilitation program that they can go through. If they complete the program, then their charges of prostitution are dropped. The program includes things like financial literacy, connecting them to job opportunities. They get a social worker to do weekly check-ins. They also do weekly check-ins with the judge. And the national recidivism rate, and yes, I'll make sure to leave 15 minutes. So recidivism is when people go back to what they were doing while they were being trafficked. So that could mean someone for prostitution is arrested for prostitution. They go through the justice system. They might not do it for a while, then they go back to it. That is how people go back to it. And usually at the national rate, the recidivism rate is about 80%. For Catch Court, it is a lower recidivism rate for the participants who have graduated, which is about 18%, which is way lower. So that is a huge statistic. Unfortunately, only about a quarter of the participants tend to graduate. But if they don't graduate, then they're allowed to continue attempting to complete the program. And I think this is a really positive program overall. Like, again, my opinion, because I think it's important to note that trafficking is complex and what the victims are going through is very complex. And a lot of times there are crimes that victims commit in the course of survival when they're being trafficked. And I think that this program recognizes that complexity and gives victims a path towards changing that narrative for themselves. However, there are a lot of criticisms. So for example, this court focuses on prostitution charges rather than solicitation charges. So meaning that it focuses on penalizing and then rehabbing victims instead of penalizing and changing the behavior of pimps or johns. So once again, it's not perfect, but I think it is an interesting example of one way to approach this particular issue. Here we go. Yeah, I had one more example that's specific to law enforcement. Again, I talked a lot about vulnerabilities of
We're here.
immigration in the US and smuggling. So actually, if people are trafficked in the US and part of the trafficking was that they were brought to the US from a different country, they can report to law enforcement, and then they're eligible for a special visa that allows them a path to legal status. So it takes deportation off the table and takes that tool out of the trafficker's toolbox. It can assist with alleviating some financial burden that might have created opportunity for trafficking because there are employment opportunities with the T visa. And then in the cases of especially minors who are brought to the US for trafficking, it allows them to maintain their social support because they may not have any family or connections in the country that they would have to be deported back to. Again, it's not perfect. There are cons in that it requires law enforcement cooperation, which is a huge hurdle for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. Could be cultural, linguistic. And then it also doesn't guarantee removal from the trafficker's influence. People are very likely to stay in communities where they know people, and their trafficker is probably someone that is very close to the community. So again, not perfect, but this is another way of taking some of the burden off the victim, especially in the course of a federal investigation. So that was a lot. I have some resources here that I will just leave up. I like to reference these, and I will say the book No Visible Bruises is about domestic violence, but it really covers in depth that power and control wheel that I talked about earlier in the presentation. So with that, I'm more than happy to take questions, and I would love to hear from you all your perspectives and experience with these topics.
Thank you so much, Paige. That was great. Anyone have questions? I mean, I know I have some, but I want to give everyone else an opportunity to please ask.
Hi, Paige. My name's Renee Soriano. I actually do have a question. I watched a video the other day and it talked about a tenant getting trafficked by her landlord because she didn't have money to pay the rent. And I thought that was very interesting. Like you mentioned, the peddling was like very interesting. Is that something that you've actually like come across or heard about before?
Oh yeah, sadly, yes, all the time. Actually, what's very common is, unfortunately, I don't know if common is the right word, but it's not unheard of in that case with tenant landlords is for tenants to actually be the trafficker of their own children and the landlord then being, purchasing sex from the tenant's child, basically. That is something that we unfortunately have seen quite a bit of. And again, that's why it's really hard to detect because in that case, everyone who's living in that building potentially is complicit. But if you report it, you risk being evicted. If you don't do it, you risk being evicted. So yeah, anywhere there's that power dynamic there's unfortunately an opportunity for trafficking.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Kashila. I had a question when you were talking about minors, I guess, being trafficked and smuggling. I know in some cases I've heard that the parents weren't aware, right, that that was going to happen to their child. They may have thought they were going to, to be taken to America to have a better life. I guess in those cases, like you mentioned, like reuniting and maybe they won't know people, but in that case, would they try to reunite since it necessarily wasn't something that was the parents may have been aware that that was going to happen to their child when they necessarily did that?
I guess could you clarify what you mean by they didn't know that it would happen? Do you mean like having parents who pay to have their children smuggled into the US, or what do you mean?
Yeah, or like maybe I've heard of like, they were told that their child will get a job and or whatever they were told, right? They would have this better life. And so it wasn't necessarily maybe they had maybe they knew, and maybe you'll know better than me, Paige. Maybe you'll tell me like actually they really know, they just don't want to admit that they knew. But I guess I've just curious in those cases, is that, or one, I guess you could answer, are those cases truly true, right? And parents are really sort of duped as well by the smugglers or the traffickers. And then if that's the case, and that minor, like would that minor try to go back to their parent in that case, if we knew that they had a connection?
That's a really good question, and I'm just going to preface it with I'm not super familiar with minor cases because people who generally work on minor trafficking, it's usually a specialization. But I will say that I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of parents didn't know because the people who are smuggling people into the US are, they're community leaders, they're trusted, they're well known, mixed with, the dynamics going on in whatever country they're coming from, people might truly be desperate and it might be really easy to take advantage of them. I will also say in terms of reuniting with a family, I think it depends on a couple of things. Firstly, immigration policies are super dependent on whatever administration is in the White House. So it basically has been changing every 4 years at this point. the other thing is if that element of force, fraud, or coercion can be proven, in the case of minors, it doesn't need to be proven. So if we know that it's minor trafficking, then the family members are actually also eligible for the T visa along with the minor victim. So that program actually goes a long way in terms of attempting to make sure that the minor victim is not just, stranded one way or the other without social support that they need.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Paige, there's a question in the chat, and I don't know if you would have this information given your areas in Pennsylvania, but the question is there a breakdown of trafficking cases within the counties in New Jersey?
At the county level, I am not sure. I know that Polaris and the Human Trafficking Institute do state level statistics. I think statistics with human trafficking can be really unreliable because usually it's based on prosecutions, or it's based on the number of calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And there's issues with both of that because law enforcement naturally is reactive. So it's not necessarily, and it's also delayed. So it's not necessarily going to give you a good picture of what's actually going on. It's just giving you a good picture of what law enforcement has been focusing on. For the National Human Trafficking Hotline statistics, they can be a little bit skewed as well because, first of all, it's very hard for victims to self-identify as victims. It takes a really long time for victims to come to terms with that, and they may not even be calling the hotline once they realize it. So there are institutions out there that do collect statistics and compile it. I don't know. I know that New Jersey has a statewide task force, and I imagine that would probably be the best place to go to look for a county level breakdown in New Jersey, but I don't know of a large national or international institution that goes that specific into their statistic collection.
We have some experienced SPAC delegates on the line, and certainly Renee is our current chair of the task force on human trafficking for SPAC. But we also have Claire, who has quite a bit of experience on SPAC and has quite a bit of knowledge on human trafficking. So I don't know, Claire, do you have any thoughts on that or any? I guess the
hi, Paige. It's lovely to meet you, and I hope we see you again. Welcome to New Jersey.
Thanks.
It's awesome, and thank you so much for this amazing presentation. Melissa is also with us, who is also very experienced in this area, up, down, sideways. So just to give you a quick recap, junior leagues and SPACs were involved with the first domestic violence and women's violence legislation back in the late 90s that happened federally, and the first human trafficking laws that were written by Representative Chris Smith, who is from New Jersey, who we still work with. Back in like 2010, I think it was, we experienced the annual horrendous trafficking event of all, which was called the Super Bowl. We organized not-for-profits all over New Jersey to be trained in advance to prepare the local hotels, police officers, and not-for-profits to stand by and be ready and how to properly respond in a trauma-informed way to the Super Bowl events, which are a horrible trafficking event always. At the end of that, the 100+ organizations in New Jersey who participated said, wow, we are not trafficking organizations in many cases. Some of us are, some of us aren't. We're from all over the public service sector, healthcare, law enforcement, social service agencies, boys and girls clubs, you name it. Everybody was in there. Universities, it's hotel, motel operators, unions, transportation workers, all of it. But we all work in a situation where we are going to interact with trafficking victims, and you've now trained us in that. We want to be able to continue to work together on this. How do we do it? And so we formed what's called the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking. I say we very loosely. Actually, the SPAC chair at that time, Kate Lee, was the person who needs to be given full faith and credit here. That organization is still in existence, and SPAC members, including me and Melissa and others, are still active in the coalition, and I'm actually a legislative co-chair. We just dropped 2 bills, which will hopefully get written up and numbered, and when we get past the legislative vetting, I would love to pass them to you for your support. You can take a look at that. We're still working on TVPRA reauthorization. Congratulations, Polaris got their funding. That was a fight.
Yeah.
Another story. We worked very hard and we continue to work very hard on the subject of data collection, which is, now that you've had the brief overview, what this question was, and it was an excellent question. One of the biggest problems in the trafficking area is that you can't really get resources for a crime if that crime is not documented. And if it's documented at very low numbers, you can't get anyone to pay any attention to you at a legislative or an administrative level at all. And so data is really at the core, because we throw huge amounts of money at domestic violence. We throw huge amounts of money, huge by human trafficking standards, at mental health care, and a lot of subject areas that are all intersectional to human trafficking, but not directly at the problem, in part because we don't have really got solid data. And that goes to the core of the trafficking crime itself. One of the most important tools traffickers have is shame and blame. The trafficker's tool is to convince their victims that they are at fault here, that they will not be accepted by society, that they are not the victims, that they are the perpetrators themselves, and that they will be held accountable, and to avoid all law enforcement or visibility at all, because the only ones they can really trust are their traffickers, who are the only ones who can truly accept them. So in trying to get people to come forward and actually be able to document trafficking and get serious data, we have a huge uphill battle, and we know that. The human trafficking hotline in New Jersey, there are 2. There is the state hotline, and there is the Polaris National Hotline. You need to understand in New Jersey that those are 2 very different entities. When you call Polaris, you get Paige. You get a trauma-informed professional who understands how to talk to you about your family member or your friend or yourself, who you are fearful may have had trafficking problems. You've got a conversation with somebody who's caring, who's empathetic, and who is confidential. When you call the state hotline, you're not going to get that. You're getting a state trooper. You're getting law enforcement. It is more of what I would describe as a tip line. Mm-hmm. And it is generally, which is a very important thing. Once we at the coalition have trained people to understand what the red flags are, and to understand when you think you have seen human trafficking, or you have a question in your mind, did I just deal with a trafficking victim? Very important that you never approach that particular individual, because you could cause huge harm to them as well as yourself. That's when you start using your hotlines. But that's also when you can make a decision. Do I call the state hotline? Is this something law enforcement should look into? Or do I call the human trafficking Polaris hotline, which is really more an individual-centered approach? They're both different, and they bring very different things to the table. We have unfortunately had a huge problem in New Jersey, because we have been fighting for literally 10 years to get proper recognition of and signage and advertising for the national hotline in New Jersey, even though we passed a law in 2013 requiring that our Human Trafficking Commission, which was the outgrowth of our federally funded DOJ task force, their job, one of their their jobs in their mission is to promote that hotline. Yet law enforcement and the state police and the AG's office really don't. They see it as conflicting. They see it as undercutting their role. They don't understand that all the people that they're missing on one will not go to the other. So we've had, one of the big coalition goals for SPAC and for the coalition is to make sure we promote Polaris in the national hotline and try to educate, all our service providers and law enforcement as to why these are two extremely different and both critical tools. So that's your answer.
Hey guys,
the shorter answer is we're working on reauthorizing the TVPRA, which has more money in it for data collection. Let's see.
Welcome, Danielle.
so sorry.
That's
I'm so
okay.
sorry. I actually thought it started at 7. I had I'm an adjunct at Monmouth, and I was dealing with a student, and that's why I thought I can make this. So sorry, Paige. And I'm expecting that Paige gave you her, I know you had a blurb of bio, but on the chance that Paige did what Paige normally does and understates her capabilities, I just want to give you a quick background. Paige was one of my star analysts when she was assigned to IOC2 in Washington, and she had this incredible background of choice, really, on human trafficking and having it as a topic of interest for her, and she really delved into it. What we did, Paige, did you give any insight as to what IOC2 did?
No.
And Danielle,
Okay, so IOC2.
Danielle, can you give a little background on who you are as well? And please.
I am. Okay, so my name is Danielle Gilbride. I joined Junior League a few months ago, and I retired in August for 34 years of federal service. My home parent agency was the Drug Enforcement Administration. I was a chief of intelligence there for a long time, and my last couple of years was spent down in the Beltway, where I was assigned as a liaison to what is called IOC2. It's a DOJ component that's spurred out of a strategy back in 2009, where it was the International Organized Crime Intelligence and Operations Center, and we did all things drug. So it was a great learning who had spent so many years only in the drug space, and we all kinds of trafficking, human smuggling, money laundering, arms proliferation, oligarchs, the import of teak. I remember we had Fish and Wildlife Services. I had 20 some odd analysts. Some were analysts from other agencies, and so we had all of their capabilities and skill sets, and a lot were contract analysts who had just joined or just kind of come into the intelligence field, probably a couple of years out of college or master's degrees at best. And this was their first stop before they went on to bigger and better things. Those guys wound up teaching me a whole lot. So Paige, what she did, once I realized she had this skill set and had a love for being involved in these cases, and we did some of the best international cases. A large component of our task force was HSI and FBI. And so obviously there was a lot of those types of cases. We had some great international takedowns, where we interrupted major human trafficking rings. And then what we would do as the analyst have some brown bag sessions. And so just, if we had anyone with a talent or a skill set in a certain topic, we would have them do it during lunch. So Paige gave us a quick, brief overview of human trafficking, the human trafficking scene, the human trafficking world, if you will, and where our role as Intel played into it. And I was so impressed, is an understatement, but then and inspired to do bigger things. I spent the next few months of my tenure there trying to get us involved in what they call these target lies in a specific investigation. And Paige was one of the leaders of the first targeting team, which was a huge success. And we dealt with a lot of organization, I guess I should say, that was based in Haiti and Puerto Rico and moving girls around. I don't know how much, I don't even know if that case was taken down. So I'll reserve judgment and names and stuff, but there were targets that were clergy using their positions as clergy members to bring girls over from Haiti into Puerto Rico. And there was very little bit of information. The case agents in Puerto Rico had very little analytical support. These guys took it to a whole nother level. And before you know, we had, I'm going to not even do it justice.
Oh, okay, Danielle.
Sorry, Danielle, I think you cut out.
Oh, okay, and I think we lost her. Okay, we
I'm
are
back.
okay. So so we're gonna just a few more remarks, Danielle, if you have them, and then we're gonna give have maybe another 5 minutes, a couple more questions in the next 5 minutes, and then we'll let everyone leave, or Paige can give some
Oh, I'm done. I just wanted Paige to give a brief explanation of where she brought that case. So just so you know her capabilities and her expansive knowledge of the human trafficking realm.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle from Claire, because that means I'm going to be emailing her bills shortly.
Well, Claire, she's in Pennsylvania.
She's going to get all the. I hope she'll be as excited about our pig butchering discussion as we are.
Oh, pig butchering is a good one. Yes. I could also talk about pig butchering a lot too. I'm not an expert, but that is also one of my side hustles, I guess. When I was at IFC too, I spent a lot of time trying to make sure that leadership know that pig butchering was a huge deal. But in terms of coalition work for legislation, from what I've heard at conferences and talking to people, it is very effective to hone in on the type of trafficking that you're talking about. And of course, that overarching legislation is important to have frameworks in place. But for example, one of the organizations that I have listed here is called the Network. And the network focuses on assisting states and localities with detecting trafficking that occurs within illicit massage parlors. And it is super niche, but they are super effective. One of their big passions is regulation and legislation. If New Jersey has massage parlors, they probably have illicit trafficking happening in some of those massage parlors. And I really recommend that organization as a contact. I do have a contact at that organization. You can reach out to me and get that from me if you're interested in talking more to them about what they do. But I think that is what the network is doing, I think, is a direction that a lot of advocacy groups are going to move towards in the future, in the next few years, of actually honing in on the type of trafficking that they want to stop. Because as that graphic showed, there's so many different types of trafficking, and one approach isn't going to work to stop all of them. You really have to be very specific about the groups that you're trying to reach and what specifically you're trying to stop. And then also with the data collection, it's also way easier to collect data on when you're more specific, than instead of trying to collect all of the human trafficking cases that are happening in New Jersey. It's going to be way easier to look at, okay, how many illicit massage parlors in New Jersey have conditions that could create opportunities for exploitation. And then that's easier to work with law enforcement. It's easier to work on legislation. It's much more palatable, and it's a more narrow definition of success than stopping all human trafficking. So that is my thoughts on moving forward with legislation, but I don't have a ton of experience in that space. So that's really all I can offer.
I wanted to just open the floor to Melissa Tassay. Melissa, did you have any remarks? As Claire had mentioned that you have some extensive experience as well in the space, given your experience on SPAC.
Oh, definitely nothing more than has already been said, for sure.
Okay.
Thanks for asking.
Of course. Any other questions? We want to be mindful of time. We have a couple more minutes left. Any other?
I'd just like to, if I could, it's Claire again, mention that at a future SPAC meeting, Renee and I are still talking. I'm hoping that these two new bills that we've been working on for 2 years and are now coming into the state legislature are bills that SPAC will be able to support. So stay tuned.
Awesome. That's great.
Yep,
Awesome.
that's it.
Thank you. Any more questions? And since we are recording, I am going to take this opportunity to also just to go back and repeat the bio, so we have that for our records on the recording for Paige. So Paige Kaune is a criminal analyst with the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General Insurance Fraud Section in Norristown, Pennsylvania. Prior to joining the OAG, she was an intelligence analyst with the International Organized Crime Intelligence and Operations Center under the Department of Justice, where she specialized in human trafficking investigations. Paige is also a volunteer for the Fairfax County Domestic Violence and Human Trafficking Hotline, logging over 130 hours of service as a hotline counselor. Paige holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the Ohio State University, a master's degree in global security from Johns Hopkins University, and is a certified financial crime specialist. Just want to make sure that I got that in so that we have that for our record and it's recorded. So if nothing else, thank you so much, Paige, for your support. And I'm sure you'll be hearing from Renee and Claire. Again, a wealth of knowledge from Claire, from her experience, and certainly her current role with the national, the New Jersey Coalition or Organization for Human Trafficking. And then Renee, she's going to be our lead. And so together you'll have two strong women who are advocating on this topic.
I love that. Please do reach out. I look forward to it.
Great.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
Danielle?
And thank you so much, Paige. It was a very educational and interesting topic. I happen to live in West Windsor, right near Robbinsville. I appreciate that example.
Yes, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so if there are no other questions from our guests, we'll invite you to end the call now, and then we as SPAC will continue on with the rest of our business meeting.
The regular scheduling.
Programming. So thank you everyone for joining, and then we do have this recorded, and then we'll make sure that we, provide the recording for those who were not able to make it.
Yes.
All right, thank you, Paige.
We're going to go on to our roundtable discussions for each task force. Hopefully, each task force has been able to connect at least one time and maybe kick around some ideas. And we thought we'd just see where we're at. So in no particular order, I guess in the order that I managed to type them into the agenda. Is anyone from food insecurity here that can, oh, Elise,
I am
hi.
here, and unfortunately, we have not met.
Okay.
I will make it be our goal that we do it in the next couple of weeks before our next meeting.
Okay, very good. Health equity for underserved communities. I know you've already made some incredible progress, so.
Yes. So we have, great news. So the bill for the sickle cell pilot program has passed the Senate, and it is now signed into law. So that's really, really good news. And to sort of bring everyone up to speed, it's there's a bill that's a 3-year pilot program that's appropriating $10.2 million to six municipalities in New Jersey and the underserved communities or urban areas: Paterson, Plainfield, Camden, Trenton, Newark, and Jersey City. And it's providing funding to educate, bring awareness to sickle cell disease and providing education in those areas. And so it's so there will be in the municipalities, there will be federally qualified health centers that are already established in place that will receive this money. And they will be, oh, I need to stop recording because we're now, let me think we can cut that. Hold on. How do I stop recording? Oh.